Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Movement and Performance Podcast, where it is my goal to help people get active and to reconnect with their body. Today, I have an episode on Rough and Tumble play, and my guest is Sergio Pellis. He is a professor of neuroscience at the University of Lethbridge. So I'm looking forward to this episode, and I hope you all enjoy it. Let's get right into it. So what would you say, like if you can define the difference between play, rough and tumble play, and fighting? Maybe all three might be too much at once, but what are the differences between play and rough and tumble play? Is rough and tumble play fighting? Are there differences there?
Yeah, so so there are many different ways animals, including humans, can play, all right? And rough and tumble is one of the social forms of play that some animals engage in.
Mm.
And superficially, it resembles serious fighting. But when you look at the actual structure of what animals do when they engage in rough and tumble play, it is it follows a different set of rules. So in serious fighting, the rule is, hey, I want to hit you, but I got to make sure you don't hit me back.
Mm.
And everything's geared towards, if I get the advantage, I'm going to use it to deck you out and come away unscathed.
Mm.
In rough and tumble play, even though we're competing to get an advantage over one another, if I follow that fighting rule, you will very quickly become uninterested in playing with me anymore
Mm.
because there's no chance for you to reciprocate. And
Mm.
so different animals have different ways of incorporating rules of cooperation within the competition that allows the play to be reciprocal.
Mm.
And so you see animals doing things in rough and tumble play that you'd never see them do in serious fighting, which is, if I've got the advantage, I will now sabotage that advantage to allow you to turn the tables on me. You would never
Right.
do that in a real fight.
Right. Wow. So we can say that rough and tumble play is not fighting, right? Like when I was growing
It's
up,
not fun.
yeah.
Yeah.
When I was
Yeah.
growing up, a lot of, you hear a lot of comments, and especially I also work for the school system, that you know comments as to why rough and tumble play would not be good, because you're teaching kids fighting and you're teaching them to be rough and you're teaching them to, and there's all these assumptions and thoughts. So what would you say, rough and tumble play, what is it teaching animals? What are they learning from that?
Yeah. So for for a lot of animals, non-human animals, rough and tumble play is probably the most common form of social play that they engage in.
Mm.
And because in rough and tumble play, you have to follow these rules of how to insert cooperation into the competitive game.
Mm.
What you're learning is basic negotiation skills, like
Mm.
how far can I deviate away from the rules and you still tolerate
Mm.
it? If I push too far and you now retaliate in a rougher way, how can I make amends? So I have to pay attention to all kinds of things, like what's our history together of how many times do I win the contest and still convince you to keep playing with me versus um, how many times do I need to occasionally let you now reciprocate to keep you interested? To do that, I have to pay attention to what my own body is doing, how rough I am acting towards you. I have to pay attention to what you're doing. I have to use my short-term memory as to how we've been playing the last little while has played out. So I'm using all these things, and I'm having to attend to all kinds of issues. If if you think about um, what I said about earlier about if you've got the advantage, you then do something to sabotage that advantage. Well, part of that sabotage means that I now voluntarily lose control,
Mm.
right? I put myself in a situation where I lose the control I have. That tends to initiate things like anxiety, emotional reactivity. And so now I have to also work on my impulse control to go, okay, that's okay. Just chill out. I can lose control here and I don't have to react to it. So
Mm.
that you've got all these things that you have to do in order to be able to negotiate this interaction. And all those things I mentioned are all things called executive functions. And these executive functions are dependent on prefrontal cortical connection circuitry here.
Mm.
And what we found with rats, and somebody else has found with hamsters as well, that if the play, that this rough and tumble play in the juvenile period influences both the development of social skills, which are dependent on things like short-term memory, impulse control, so on, these executive functions, and it modifies the development of the anatomy and physiology of the cells forming the circuits in the prefrontal cortex. So you look at that and you go, okay, so clearly if you've played, then you're better able to deal with unpredictable situations later in life, make better decisions as to what they may, what impact they may have on you, and what kind of action you need to take when you're facing them.
Mm.
And for social animals, often that is most pronounced in the social context.
Right. Which, I'm just thinking the whole time, like a lot of the things that you're saying sound like qualities of a good leader, but also just qualities of any human being that has to interact with others. And we're social beings. Like sometimes we forget how social we are. And everything in life has this social aspect there. If you can't know how to deal with others, and maybe have the experience and the brain wiring to be able to deal with others, I think it's a big setback in life.
Yeah.
So yeah, it sounds to me like the that rough and tumble play is wiring the brain in a way that it can function well in a social atmosphere. And I know you touched on some, but what are some of the wirings that we're talking about when we're talking about how it's changing the brain? You mentioned a little about the frontal cortex, if I'm not mistaken, but what are I was listening to one of your I think it was something on YouTube that I searched, but there was pieces like the MPC or the VMPC, and maybe some of those aspects.
Yeah. So the the prefrontal cortex, there's several different components to it.
Mm.
And and the area that we found is most influenced by this rough and tumble play experience, at least in rats, is an area called the medial prefrontal cortex.
Mm.
So think of medial being sort of in the middle, and right, so it's sort of right here. If you opened up my skull, you'd see two hemispheres, and it's right where the two hemispheres meet, right in the front.
Almost like your third eye. Some
Yeah,
people,
pretty
that's
much.
your
Yeah,
third eye.
pretty
Yeah.
much. Yeah, and and one of the things that happens during the development of the brain, particularly the cortex, is that during early development, you have a proliferation of neurons. So you have lots of neurons developing, lots of branches. So the connections between neurons are made with axons and dendrites, which think of them as branches on a tree.
Mm.
Okay. And so you get this proliferation of the number of neurons, proliferation in the amount of branching that's present. And then typically what happens is that either through intrinsic genetic programming or based on expected environmental experiences, the number of cells, the amount of branching, the complexity of the branching gets pruned down to the most efficient functional level of connections, right? So basically, you've got to sculpt the brain to get it to have the form that is able to do the things you need it to do.
Mm.
And play is one of those sculpting forces that helps shape the the number of neurons, the amount of branching, the number of connections between neurons in this medial prefrontal area. And and what we've shown is, in particular, the most clear connection is that one of the things that happens if your medial prefrontal cortex is not working particularly well is that your ability to coordinate your movements with those of a social partner is a little bit off.
Mm.
And consequently, when you put animals in certain situations where if they're not quite coordinated, they can end up in an aggressive escalate to an aggressive situation, that's more likely to happen. So being able to coordinate with another animal is really critical. And in fact, one of the clues that I had years ago is reading the literature on courtship behavior in humans. And it turns out that couples that end up being able to maintain a long-term relationship the best are ones that early on in the courtship did things like dance together.
Mm.
And if you find that, you can dance together and not step on each other's feet as much, you're more likely to be attuned to one another in other domains and more likely to sustain a long-term relationship. And so when we looked at rats, you go, oh yeah, rat, some animals just have that misstep, annoys the shit out of the other animal, and
Yeah.
then the other animal gets upset and off they go.
Wow, yeah, my brain went in about 20 different directions at different points in that conversation. So one analogy I usually give, and I'm curious your thoughts on it, is the brain is almost like a map, how there's all these different roads that go out. And then in that developmental stage, you end up using some roads more than others. And the other roads kind of, I guess, get less support. And the roads that are used the most, like if I'm going to Albany all the time, it's going to be built out, a little bit more. So it's almost like the wirings in the brain. So the ones that you're using, would you say that they kind of get built out more and the other ones start to prune? Is that what you were touching on?
Yeah, I think that would be a good analogy. Yeah.
This is probably an interesting study to be done, or I don't know, I'm just thinking of it now, but do you think that the physical aspect plays a big role? So what I mean by that is someone who's rough and tumble playing in person with an actual other person versus rough and tumble type of play maybe on a video game. Whereas like you're there, I'm here, and we're playing, I don't know, Mortal Kombat. It's still a form of like rough and tumble play, but do you think I don't think a study like that has been done, but do you think the physical aspect plays a big role?
Yeah, so there is a little clue, and there was a beautiful study done by a Dutch group, and they published it in 2018. And obviously, with humans, you can't do the experiments we can do with rats, where, okay, we get some rats, isolate them, prevent them from playing, get other ones, give them the opportunity to play, and then compare the consequences. Well, you can't obviously do that with kids because one, it's illegal, and most parents probably wouldn't want to volunteer their children to an adverse experience. But what this group capitalized on is, well, sometimes young kids have to be isolated from peers. And
Mm.
one group of kids are kids that have got some chronic disease where they're spending a long period of time in hospital and they haven't got direct access to peers, right? And so what they did was they compared this cohort of kids in hospitals with a matched control group who are living in the real world and looked at over the time period that they had, and I think it was well over a year, they looked at the progress in the maturation of these executive functions. How well are they developing? And what they found was that the kids living in the real world, the executive functions are going up at a high rate. The ones in hospital are going at a much shallower rate of maturation, suggesting, there's things going on in the real world that's helping promote the development of this area of the brain. But this now directly to your question, they broke it down and looked at, well, some kids in hospital did engage in video games with their peers. So even though they weren't connected, right? And what they found was those kids, the rate of maturation of the prefrontal cortex was higher than the kids not engaging in any play, but it was lower than the kids engaging in real life. For me, what that suggests is one of the key features about rough and tumble play that could be a really crucial component of some of these benefits is the fact that there's actual physical contact. So touching one another. We know now that touch is an important way of doing things like inducing the release of things like oxytocin, and oxytocin is a pro-social kind of neurotransmitter, neuromodulator, and we also know that when you're bathed with oxytocin, you're more likely to be capable of learning new things. So there's a whole feedback circuit here that touch can be an important component of what's going on, as well as when you touch someone, you can see, I can give you an example from my own life. My wife and I have an argument, and a day later I say, "Are you okay?" We're fine. And she can say yes, but if you touch her on the shoulder at the same time and you get the tenseness of the muscles, you go, "Okay, you're not fine." Right? And so
many people correlate, I'm sure.
Yeah. And we underappreciate the power of touch as a vehicle for social communication and coordinating each other's moods, behaviors, etc. So I think, these video things are better than nothing, but they're not going to replace everything that the actual physical behavior provides.
That's a win for my podcast and why I do it, But yeah, I love the way you put that, and your point's well taken. I had another question about it was something you said about, I think, siblings in one of the podcast or one of the YouTube videos I was listening to, but is it true that the more siblings someone had, it's almost like the more opportunities for rough and tumble play, the more siblings, maybe the more younger peers you're around that are your age. I think about it today, I have my nephew, and I used to be outside playing all the time, but he's I also had my sibling, I had my sister, and he doesn't have any siblings, and he doesn't get outside as much. And you compare that to somebody who maybe plays a lot with other kids their age and maybe also has a lot of siblings. Does it seem like there's a correlation between more playful experiences and more siblings, and more surrounding yourself around that environment could be beneficial for youth?
Yeah, I think there is. And there's a couple of sort of clues to suggest that, that is really true. One of the clues is that the recent COVID period where people were enforced to not interact, and so kids are even more limited, right? The consequences of that now has been documented in several publications showing that social skills levels have gone down, and anxiety about doing things outside the home has increased. So there's all kinds of negative things that have happened, and that's sort of like a natural experiment. right? That suggest,
Right.
okay, reducing things is not good. My wife and I have got some um, young great nieces and nephews who a good chunk of their life was over that 2-year period of COVID. But because there were two siblings from one sister and two siblings from the other, and both sisters were very close, so the four kids spent a lot of time together.
Mm.
When we went home after 4 years interlude, we could see no disruption to their social skills because
Mm.
they had a lot of opportunity to interact with one another. So I think, yep, the opportunity to interact really has an impact. Now, a formal study which actually provides some data, I think you'll find interesting. So back in the 60s and early 70s, when there weren't so many legal issues, people interested in studying rough and tumble play in children simply went to schoolyards and in recess time with cameras and just filmed kids playing, right?
Right.
And what they did was they collected a bunch of interactions among kids. And then after they filmed them, they went to those kids and asked, well, were you playing or were you fighting?
Mm.
And using that feedback, they came up with here's a set of sequences of interactions which are clearly rough and tumble, right? That we're convinced because of the feedback that rough and tumble, and ones that are clearly agonistic, aggressive, right? Then they spooled this together, so they just had different interactions, some aggressive, some playful, and then they played that to subjects, kids. So you ask, you know, 9-year-old, 10-year-old kids, show them the film and say, can you tell us what the kids are doing on the film? Are they playing or are they fighting? Most of the kids, not 99% of the time, they get it right.
Mm.
You show it to adults, the same thing. And males, adult males tend to get it right about 70, 80% of the time.
Mm.
For a lot of the female subjects that they use to make these judgments, pretty much they're under 50%. So
Wow.
basically for them, it's, if in doubt, it's aggression.
Mm.
So overestimating the amount of aggression. But what the researchers noticed was the variance in the bar graphs that they had was much greater in the adult females than the adult males. So they went back to the adult females to probe more about their background history.
Mm.
And what they found was that the adult women who grew up in households with other siblings, especially brothers, were better able, their performance was much higher. They could discriminate between real and non-real fighting. Whereas girls, particularly women who grew up in a household without children, without
Mm.
other siblings, and especially no brothers, their performance was really low. So
Mm.
that to me suggests that, yeah, um, your direct experience enables you to zero in on potentially subtle cues to be able to make discriminations about what these interactions mean to the people that are engaged in them.
Wow. And do you think that there's gender differences? So in boys and girls, do boys do more rough and tumble play than girls, or is that more of a cultural piece? Do you see that in rats? Do boys and girls both rough and tumble play?
Yeah, so this we have to break this down in several ways. First, there are species where there are clear sex differences. So the males engage in the behavior way more than the females, right?
Mm.
But then there are species where there's no difference. And for your audience, that many of whom have pets, cats are one of those cases.
Mm.
Girl cats rough and tumble just as much as boy cats. right?
Mm.
If you're a dog owner, boy dogs tend to engage in more rough and tumble play than girl dogs. So there are some differences depending on the species. In rats, the early studies on rats suggested yet that there's male rats engage in more rough and tumble play than female rats. But then things started sort of falling apart in that simple dichotomy because, and we found this ourselves, that depending on the rearing condition, you can either exaggerate that sex difference or you can diminish it.
Mm.
So if you have where you are more likely to get the difference is if you rear rats in a context where they're in a mixed litter of both boys and girls.
Mm.
In that situation, the boy rats end up playing more than the girl rats. However, if you just rear a pair of girls together or a pair of boys together, so they've got social partners, but not a group and not
Right.
the two sexes, the amount of play is exactly the same. So that means that it's true that early organizational effects of particularly testicular hormones shape the brain to make boy brains more inclined to play. But
Mm.
then how strongly that is expressed depends on the social environment within which they grow up. So
Mm.
it's not sort of really built in that if you're a boy, you have to play this much, and if you're a girl, you have to play this much.
Right. Because my assumption would be, wherever kids naturally gravitate towards. I think the biggest issue is if a kid is gravitating toward that, and then we're restraining them from it. But if there's a girl that's gravitating towards rough and tumble play, I'm sure they would get the benefits just as much as a boy would.
Yeah, and so there's two important issues to. I think you just hit something that's really important for the audience.
Mm.
So for rats, what we've shown is and it took a long time to find an appropriate paradigm where we can give boys and girls exactly the same experiences,
Mm.
right? But what we found is that male rats and female rats benefit equally from engaging in rough and tumble play as children, right?
Mm.
It has the same effect on the development of the medial prefrontal cortex, and it has similar effects on the social skills that they acquire, right? There are some studies from other laboratories showing that, yeah, both male and female rats benefit, but there may be subsets of the cognitive emotional capabilities that are influenced differently in female rats than male rats. So there
Mm.
may still be some important sex differences there, but both benefit. So it's it's
Yeah.
so it's
Good to
not
know.
boys get the benefit, girls don't.
Right.
Um, the second issue is that in humans, again, if we go back to studies from the 60s and early 70s where researchers could do this, if you just watch kids in at recess in the schoolyard, what it turned out is that social play is one of the most commonly engaged in forms of play in these contexts.
Mm.
And rough and tumble play constitutes about 10% of that social play.
Mm.
So for rats, rough and tumble play constitutes 90% of the social play they engage in. In humans, it's 10%. So that means that other 90% involves other forms of playful interactions
Mm.
with peers.
Mm.
In that context, um, it would suggest that in humans, engaging in play socially is important, but it doesn't have to be restricted to rough and tumble,
Mm.
right? But on average, boys do enjoy the rough and tumble more than the average girl,
Mm.
and some boys enjoy it more than other boys.
Mm.
So from a practical point of view, kids should be given the opportunity to gravitate to the forms of social play that they find most enjoyable. Because if they find them more enjoyable, they're more likely to extract the benefits out of engaging in that kind of play rather than being told, if you're a boy that really likes rough and tumble, no, you're not allowed to do that. You've got to go do this other social game. And if you're not motivated, you're probably not going to get the same benefits out of doing something that you really like.
Mm.
So I think it's important to allow kids to pick and choose the kinds of social play that best fits their personality, their emotional system, whatever, to be able to then gain the maximum benefit out of that play.
Do you think that adults can benefit from rough and tumble play?
Well, I think we do, uh, but in a different way. What we've found in rats, and then we sort of validated in some other species, is that play tends to peak in that juvenile period, which is in humans what we call childhood. So from about 3 years old to just before puberty.
Mm.
And so peaking in our play there, and that's about the equivalent age where rats peak in their play. But then rats will wane in the amount of play that they have as they hit puberty, adolescence, and early adulthood.
Mm.
But they keep playing. They will still play, and they will use. But now the play is used in a much more utilitarian way. So it's a case of, if we're two rats living together in a colony, and you happen to be the dominant rat, what I will do now and again is come up to you and initiate some play, basically trying to keep on friendly terms with you. And
Mm.
then typically, if you then respond to me playfully, I'll adopt a style of play which is more juvenile-like to basically let you know, yep, I still recognize you as the dominant. So you're using the play as a social tool to negotiate social relationships.
Mm.
And I think in humans, we're one of the species that do continue to show play behavior as adults.
Mm.
And one of the things that we use it for is, I think, exactly that we use it as a way of negotiating, reinforcing, testing our social relationships. And I think, excuse me, I have to blow my nose.
For it. Go for it. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and and one of the ways that is very rough and tumble play like is jokes,
Mm.
right? We joke with one another. Often the jokes are made at somebody's expense in the group.
Mm.
And again, you're using that as a way of testing, well, have I still got the same relationship with you that I had before?
Mm.
I mean, I experienced this when I first joined the faculty that I'm in. I was the junior member, and one of the senior members in particular always sort of made me the butt of the joke
Mm.
in the group, right? But then gradually I showed more and more assertiveness as my position in the faculty became stronger, and yeah, eventually put him in his place. I'm no longer the butt of the joke,
Right.
right?
Right.
And so, but he's using it to see where his relationship with me is. I'm using it to signal to him where I think my relationship with him is. But again, because we're doing it in a playful way, and joking is like rough and tumble play, because you can always go, oh, if you're really offended, oh shit, man, I was only joking, right? Just like, oh, sorry, I hit you so hard, I was only playing, right?
Right.
So the same basic idea.
Right.
Think we've got these social functions of play, of rough and tumble play in adulthood.
Mm.
And in addition to that, I think we also probably have other potentially valuable functions like doing things to force you to engage your brain in ways that may slow down the rate of decline, the onset of dementia, and all those nasty things that come with aging.
Yeah, there was a lot of pieces I thought of there. So one, it seems almost like play and rough and tumble play maybe, or joking, is the most efficient way to establish relationships without having to go to the extreme of like warfare, right? It's like, oh, let's establish this in a way that nobody has to get hurt, kind of like it's very efficient for humans to do that. And then, yeah, my thought is also the dynamic aspects. When I'm usually thinking about physical activity, I'm thinking about how can I make it more dynamic so the brain gets more benefits. So, for example, as opposed to running on a treadmill is very linear. It's the same thing on repeat. Whereas when I'm in rough and tumble play, there's so many dynamic components that I have to figure out. And I think the more dynamic it is, it becomes human chess. It now benefits the brain, like you're saying, in ways like dementia and things like that. And I'm not necessarily sure if rough and tumble play, how it compares to other dynamic activities, but just the fact that it's dynamic in and of itself helps you to reap some benefits that running on a treadmill alone wouldn't be able to do regarding your brain. So I guess if someone still gravitates towards rough and tumble play as an adult, it's beneficial in other aspects, but you probably could get that benefit from other dynamic activities. But if you gravitate, like you said, to the point with kids, if you gravitate towards it, you'll be more likely to do it and stay consistent with it. So it's still a good tool for you. And I was thinking in my head, I'm wondering if I just never left my juvenile stage, even though I'm 36 and still love rough and tumble play. Yeah. But the other question I wanted to ask was about preserving fitness. And this one might be more, of just your opinion, but more so preserving fighting fitness. Like something I've noticed in cultures is that people will use the game will replicate things that they need to survive. So for example, Mongolians have a game where you're on horseback and doing things on horseback, and horseback was very valuable for actual warfare. Samurais, you need to be good at the sword, and they made a game out of it, and it was kendo. Some maybe don't always say it's a game, but you'll see in a lot of cultures that a lot of games mimic things they need in survival. And do you think that rough and tumble play helps to preserve fighting fitness? That if you do find yourself in a scenario where you need to get scrappy with somebody, that you're more able to do that?
But potentially. And again, that's where I think the comparative perspective sort of really helps. So when you look at a range of animals that engage in rough and tumble play, irrespective of who you are, what species you are, what group you belong to, remember I said that what makes rough and tumble play distinctive from serious fighting is the incorporation of cooperation, so that there is some reciprocity. But different types of animals have inserted cooperation in different ways. So, for example, in rats, the cooperation actually comes at the time that you're executing the behavior that you're using in that particular fighting moment, right? So you're actually showing restraint in how you're executing the behavior, which makes it not very good as a tool for training fighting fitness, right? However, some other species, and pigs are a really great example, they show no such restraint. The only time they show restraint is once they get the advantage, is if the other animal shows submission behavior, right? But until then, I'm just going to keep kicking the ass out of you, right? So if you're a pig, you would actually get potentially a lot of fighting skill enhancement, and probably maintain that fighting skill at a good level, right? So again, it depends on the species. And for humans, I suspect that, like the examples you gave, it's probably extremely variable across cultures, depending on what's really useful, right?
Right.
So in cultures like ours, where there are strict rules about, if a colleague sort of annoys you, you just can't turn around and punch him in the face. You're likely to go to jail, lose your job. It's right. So in some situations, you the most important thing you're going to help learn from your play experience is how to show that impulse control and hold back and figure out, okay, how else can I deal with this egregious behavior from my colleague in a way that protects me, but at the same time, I can pay them back, right? Whereas in cultures like, well, it used to be very strongly the case in the southern parts of the United States, where it was your honor is everything. So if somebody challenges you in a way that you feel your honor's dissed, then you're going to have a duel, you're going to have a knife fight, you're going to have a gunfight, whatever, right? So,
Mm.
so they're probably using the play as a way of practicing those skills could be helpful. So it's probably very varied in the human case, because the cultural context is going to really greatly influence the value of what you're going to get out of the play for later uses.
Mm. Yeah, that makes sense. It seems like nowadays, fighting culture nowadays is being able to write an email in a way that is that is able to express your point and clearly, without, But yeah, I get your point in regards to, you know, culturally how that may work in some instances and may not in other instances, and some of it may be more the social emotional aspect, like you're saying, the impulse control, um,
Yeah.
and all of those pieces as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm of Italian background, but my family migrated to Australia when I was 3 years old. And so this is in the 50s. So I grew up in a very British kind of culture.
Mm.
And the way you stick it to somebody is by inserting some sarcasm
Mm.
in the comment, right? So it's, and again, because it's in a sort of joking context, you can always back off if you really get a strong reaction back, but you make your point without actually risking getting into a fight.
Yeah, very interesting stuff there. So, one of the questions I wanted to ask, and we'll slowly start to wrap up as we come to the end here, but when an animal is play fighting, and I'm sure humans might be a little different, what's one of the thing? What are they trying to do? Like, what's the goal of that experience for them?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. Um, so in most cases that I've seen, when you're engaged in play fighting, you're typically trying to gain access to some advantage. Now, in rats, the advantage is for one rat to gain access to the back of the neck of the other rat and then get the nose and rub the nose into the back of the neck.
Mm.
And the one that's attacked will do things to protect the back of the neck and fight the other one off. And so you get this competition, right? And then the one that fights the other one off may then lunge up and try to get at the other one's back of the neck. And so you got this competition for the back of the neck.
Mm.
So so it's not that they're just randomly doing actions. All the actions are geared towards this gaining this advantage. Some animals will, and if think of dogs, they will compete to bite parts of the body which are bitten during serious fighting, such as the back of the neck, the throat, or the muzzle. All right. And so again, they're competing to get a particular advantage.
Mm.
And again, what makes play fighting different from serious fighting is that the animals will even though 70% of the time it's about competing to get that advantage over one another, they will they will do things to make it possible for the other animal to gain the upper hand. And so you've got this cooperation element creeping in, and you get this reciprocal action. And in that context, it turns out that for many animals, if let's say I'm a rat and you just another rat and you just stand there and you don't do anything, so you let me keep running up, nuzzling the back of your neck, and I run away. I do that 100 times and I go, you're a really boring play partner.
Mm.
And it turns out that actually what makes me getting to your neck more interesting, more fun, is if you put up some resistance. So I have to overcome some challenge in order to get there. And there's increasing evidence coming out, including from the literature on children, that animals will go out of their way to make gaining the goal of the playful interaction more difficult. They will choose the more difficult way of doing it rather than the easier way, suggesting that it's not only getting the goal that's rewarding, but having to the challenge to
Mm.
get to the goal is also an important part of that rewarding process.
Mm. It almost makes me think also a little bit about it reminds me of flirting a bit, right? Like, I don't know if there's a correlation between the two. Like, there's a bit of that, like play fighting, or when people are in a courting point, someone, you use the term like hard to get, right? Someone plays a little harder to get, and then they go, and there's a little bit of this same playful type of dynamic. And yeah, it just almost makes me think that I wonder if there's any connection between rough and tumble play and flirting amongst animals or things like that.
Yeah, there's there's both in the human literature and there's observations in some animals, other animals, that depending on the kind of social system you have, when males and females meet and they're trying to negotiate, whether they're going to have sex or not, that flirting component involves some elements of rough and tumble play.
Mm.
Yeah, this even been
Yeah.
reported in things like grizzly bears, where they live solitary lifestyles, but then when a female's starting to get receptive and a male detects a smell and then he comes over to her, they use rough and tumble play as a way of getting over the initial hostility that they have because they're solitary animals, and then they use it as a way of weaving together that coordination that mostly convinces the female that, yeah, this is a good guy to have kids with.
Yeah, it's back, I guess, to that social aspect in a low stakes way, right? You're
Yeah.
establishing a relationship in a low stakes way where, like you said before, you can throw a hint out, and if the person doesn't respond, you could say, I was just joking. So it's back to whether it's leadership, whether it's warfare, whether it's establishing dominant, whether it's relationship. It's just this low stakes way of establishing social connections and relationships and understandings. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
the would you be able to identify the components of what makes play play, or what makes rough and tumble play? I guess it's a little more of back to that definition, but like when I could maybe share. I did a PowerPoint one time for a recess in schools, and I was trying to establish like what makes play play, and there were a couple of things that I was trying to hint at, and I'm curious your opinion or if they fall somewhat in line with your research. But for example, I said the activity should be dynamic, so it should have a lot of moving pieces. The activity should be low stakes. It was dynamic, it was low stakes, and there was another piece there I can't think of at the moment. But are there certain components that you would say make up play?
Yeah. the two things you said certainly fit. Often it is a voluntary activity, right? That if you're told, okay, Anthony, go and play for 10 minutes, like it's not going to work, right?
Right.
It has to be something spontaneous and voluntary on your behalf to make it play, right? There's the activity itself has to be rewarding, so there doesn't have to be some, it's not like making dinner where the reward of the cooking is the end product where you sit down and eat. It's the actual process of cooking that should be enjoyable, and it's the same thing with play. So there are features that seem to be consistently true for when an animal is playing that, yeah, it looks like play. The trouble with all these features, though, is there's always exceptions.
Right.
And so, for example, one thing that typically is true of play is it's usually happens if you're in a low stress, low threat context, right? Like if bombs are going off outside, you're probably not going to be running around playing in the street.
Right.
But there are growing examples where in some situations, and there's a nice study done with horses where a dominant horse will engage subordinate horses into some rough and tumble play. And just by looking at it, you look, oh yeah, they're following the rules, and so it looks like rough and tumble play. But if you measure the cortisol levels in the horses, after the play, it's way higher in the subordinate horse, even though it looked like it was playing and enjoying it, right? So clearly, yeah, I'm doing this because I have to, not really because I want to.
Right.
So yeah, any of these definitions, any of these characteristics, you can't use them as, they're written in stone.
Yeah.
They're not, because you're going to find deviations away from them. It doesn't mean it's not play, but it means that the experience that individual is having in that situation when it's playing may not be the same as it would have in another context.
So, final two questions. I know I had so many, but I felt like I was just looking back at my list here and I'm like, oh, I don't want to not ask these. They were just two good ones.
Okay.
But would you say that play is homeostatic? Is it, if you restrict it, is it inhumane? Is it something that we require as animals, would you say?
Yeah, I think the answer is yes. That there was a beautiful study, series of studies done by a couple of primatologists back in the 1970s. They studied squirrel monkeys and they looked at play in populations of squirrel monkeys across South America. And what they found was that some populations had higher levels of play than others. And they correlated that with the abundance and the ease with which they could find food. So if you're living in a place where finding food takes you most of the day, well, you're not going to spend much time playing. Population where food's easy to get, you play a lot. So they replicated that in a laboratory situation with squirrel monkeys. So what they did was they had a group of squirrel monkeys with enough youngsters in there to get a good amount of play, and they looked at, okay, over the day, how much time do you engage in play, right? Under standard conditions where food is freely available and so on, and you get this level of play. Then they made it so that the food is available, but it's hard to get. You have to go stick your hand in crevices to try to find where there's food and so on. And so now you're spending most of your time looking for food. And so here's your play under baseline conditions. Then it drops down to a much lower level during this food restriction period, right? Then after several days, they offered the animals food ad libitum again, so they can access it easily. And now the play doesn't only come up back to the baseline level, but it overshoots. It goes much higher for a period of time, and then it comes back down to that baseline level. So to me, what that suggests is that when you're denied playing, you actually wanted to play at that baseline level and you couldn't. So now when you get the opportunity to play, you're going to try to regain a lot of that lost play. And when you've regained it, then you come back to the normal level. That to me suggests homeostasis.
I love that. I love it. And would you say, this is the final question here, when I think about the brain, sometimes I divide, I mean, you shouldn't divide anything into binaries, but I'm thinking about being flexible and being rigid. And it almost seems like when someone has more playful experiences, it wires their brain to be a bit more flexible. And that flexibility allows for someone to maybe be more creative. It potentially could make them more adaptable in different environments. You know, if you're a polar bear in a forest and you now have to figure out how to survive, you need some flexibility. You can't be too rigid. Do those playful experiences wire people's brains to be more, or animals, to be more flexible, to be more adaptable, to be more creative?
Yeah. Again, what we've shown with rats and some other animals is that ones that have had a goodly amount of play experiences, juveniles, they're more capable of dealing with unpredictable problems later in life. Okay. So that would suggest what you just said. If that's directly related to the play and to the changes in the brain, uncertain, right? But there are some really nice correlational studies, both with primates and with birds, showing that animals that have greater ability to be flexible, say, in terms of I'm in an environment where my typical food's not available. Can I adjust to eating different things? And most importantly, find new ways of having to collect those new things, which may be different to what was useful for collecting the things I was used to. That flexibility is correlated with enlargement of the prefrontal cortex in the primates and the equivalent, I think, called the nidopallium in birds. So that it looks like, yeah, these areas of the brain help you be more flexible. And since these areas of the brains are the ones that seem to be most strongly influenced by play experience within a species, then I don't think it's an unreasonable supposition, or at least a hypothesis worth testing, is that the play does enhance that potential creativity. And then the trick is to figure out exactly how that happens, what kind of creativity, and so on and so on.
The areas of the brain that play is impacting, are those neurons, are there more neurons there? Are they bushier? Are they, like, how are you able to observe that an area of the brain is more developed than another?
Yeah, so this goes back to what I said earlier, that for for many parts of the brain, especially the cortex, the typical developmental process is to get more neurons and bushier neurons, and then with appropriate experiences, sculpt them down to the most efficient number and bushiness. And so what we can do is do two things. You can measure by a particular kind of staining, just how many neurons are present in a brain, in this area of the brain, for rats that have had appropriate play experience versus ones that haven't. And then there's another kind of staining you can do to actually look at how bushy the neurons are and have ways of measuring the bushiness. and you find again that the rats that are played have less bushy medial prefrontal neurons.
Mm.
And then other people have used physiological techniques to ask, well, how responsive are those neurons to particular stimulation from other neurons?
Mm.
And again, what you find is that the ones that have had play experience tend to have better responsiveness than ones that don't. So we see changes at all these levels.
I absolutely love it. Yeah, that hit all the important questions I wanted to hit. I always give an opportunity for the guests if there's anything maybe you wanted to share, any last words. You don't have to have any, but just opening the floor before we close out.
Um, yeah, no, so I think you pretty much forced me to cover most of the things that are important to me. Um, I just want to give one little plug though, particularly for
Please
people
do.
that are in a situation where they're having to think of how do you translate all this information from animal research, experimental research into the practical world of, okay, what do I do with my kids? What do I do with these kids at school, right?
Mm.
And I think one of the things that is really important that we've learned is that there's a lot of individual variation.
Mm.
And, even though you get these group effects, play has an important effect on this brain development. But not all rats benefit equally from the play.
Mm.
So, and I've already mentioned earlier, some rats like playing a little bit differently to other rats. So they need to be in a group situation where hopefully they can find a peer who likes the kind of play that they like.
Mm.
Again, so from a practical point of view, what I hate the message from the kind of work we've done to be is, okay, if we give all kids an hour's worth of rough and tumble play a day, they're going to be better adults. Yeah,
Mm.
that's not true. Some kids, no play is going to be helpful. For some kids, 10 minutes is all I need. For other kids, I need 2 hours, right? And so practical translation has to be not programmatic, but individual based.
Mm. I love that. And I think one of the best tools to measure that sometimes is asking questions to your kids, right? Like, what do you like? Did you enjoy that experience? Did you not? Because we're not going to start measuring their cortisol, but hopefully they're able to feel comfortable enough to tell you the truth. I like this type of play and I don't like this type of play. And, I think that in and of itself is enough of a tool to measure, some practical application of where you should direct playful experiences with your kids.
Yeah.
And I think there's no doubt they need play, but it's just a matter of how much and where they choose to get it.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, just to end a scenario that hopefully will resonate nicely with the audience. When my wife and I were writing our book on play back in the late 2000s, we spent some time going to for various reasons to Paris, and what we did we were walking home and we came across this large residential block, but in front of the residential block there was this large grassed area.
Mm.
And we just happened to be walking past when people had bringing their kids back from school. They'd collected them and brought them back. And we sat there and just watched what was going on. And the adults are standing around the periphery, talking to one another. This is France, they're smoking and talking, right? And all the kids are in the central part of this large grassed area. And what you can see is that they're engaged in different kinds of play.
Mm.
And different kids gravitate to different kids. And so you get two things. One, you get the opportunity for the kids to play, but also there's enough kids and enough space to allow different kids to aggregate together with kids that are like-minded. So you
Mm.
really get that individual opportunity to do the things you like to do. And so we looked at that and thought, oh man, this is just perfect. I mean, that's what we need. And we were just, had spent 30 years in North America by that stage, living in places where, well, there's no open areas, kids aren't encouraged to play. And so this was just a fantastic contrast.
Mm. Yeah, I absolutely love that, and it makes sense. It makes sense. It really does. So I want to thank you so much for coming on. I mean, we had some hurdles along the way, and we really made it happen. And I appreciate your patience and your resilience to keep jumping on with me. And here it is. We got a nice product from it.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity, Anthony. It's really good.
Yeah, it's something that people need to hear too. Our schools. I work for New York City schools, so it's a message that will get across for sure. And we're constantly thinking how we can think about recess programs, and I do a variety of stuff. But I know some people that are listening will, hopefully take some of the knowledge and be able to make some practical applications, parents, things like that as well.
Yep.
So. Yeah, so thank you again, and we'll stay connected through your research. If you're still doing studies, I'll be sure to follow you. Is there a way for people to stay connected with you? Is there a website or anything like that?
Uh, yeah, I don't keep my website updated, but I mean, if anybody's interested, just go on Google Scholar and
And you'll
put my
see.
name in, and you can see what are new things coming out of the lab.
Gotcha. Thank you so much. So
Okay,
I'm
thank
gonna
you.